Hi guys! Imagine lying in a frozen trench on the Eastern Front surrounded by the might of the Luftwaffe. Yet the only thing that truly terrifies you is the soft, sweeping sound of an obsolete wooden crop duster gliding silently overhead in the dead of night. These weren't advanced stealth bombers, but canvas and wood biplanes flown by young Soviet women who turned their engine idle to drop bombs with terrifying precision, earning them a legendary moniker from the Nazis themselves, the Night Witches. This is the story of how a group of determined women overcame skepticism, equipment shortages, and the most formidable army in Europe to become the most decorated female unit in aviation history. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. To truly understand the miracle of the Night Witches, we must first transport ourselves back to the summer of 1941, a time when the world seemed on the brink of total collapse, and the Soviet Union was facing an existential apocalypse known as Operation Barbarossa. In June 1941, the peace was shattered as over 3 million Axis troops surged across the border, initiating the largest invasion in the history of warfare and catching the Red Army completely off guard. The German blitzkrieg was a terrifying force of nature, decimating Soviet airfields within hours, encircling entire armies and pushing relentlessly toward Moscow with a speed that shocked the world. The situation was not just desperate, it was catastrophic, with the Soviet Air Force losing thousands of aircraft in the first few days, leaving the skies wide open for the Luftwaffe to rain destruction down upon retreating troops and fleeing civilians. In this atmosphere of total war, where every able-bodied man was being thrown into the meat grinder of the front lines, a new and radical idea began to take shape, not in the halls of the Kremlin initially, but in the mind of a woman who was already a national hero. Her name was Marina Raskova, and to the American audience the best comparison would be Amelia Earhart, but with the tactical mind of a general and the influence of a celebrity. Raskova was a famous navigator who had already set world records for long-distance flights and had captured the imagination of the Soviet public during the pre-war years. When the invasion began, Raskova's mailbox was flooded with letters from young women across the Soviet Union, from factory workers to university students, all asking the same burning question: why can't we fight? These women were watching their brothers, fathers and husbands leave for the front, often never to return, and they refused to sit idly by as their country was swallowed whole by the Nazi war machine. Historically, women in the Soviet military were relegated to support roles, serving as nurses, radio operators, or administrative staff, and the idea of women piloting combat aircraft was viewed by the male-dominated military hierarchy as ridiculous, dangerous, and a waste of resources. However, Raskova was not someone who took no for an answer, and she possessed a unique leverage that very few people in the Soviet Union had: a direct line to Joseph Stalin. Leveraging her personal fame and the sheer desperation of the military situation, she petitioned the Soviet dictator to allow her to form a dedicated female aviation unit. She argued that these women were already qualified pilots through the widespread paramilitary flying clubs that existed in the USSR, and that in a war of annihilation, wasting willing and capable talent was a strategic error. In October 1941, with German tanks literally seeing the spires of Moscow through their binoculars, Stalin finally relented and issued Order 0099, mandating the formation of Aviation Group 122, the first all-female military aviation unit in history. This was unprecedented, not just in Russia, but globally, as no other nation in World War II would allow women to fly in combat roles, let alone form entire regiments dedicated to it. Raskova immediately set to work, broadcasting an appeal for female volunteers that resonated across the nation, drawing thousands of applicants who were eager to trade their civilian lives for flight suits. The selection process was brutal and rigorous, as Raskova knew that these women would be under a microscope. Any failure would be blamed on their gender, not their skill. She selected roughly 400 women for the initial group, ranging in age from roughly 17 to 26. many of whom had never held a weapon, but were experts at navigating the skies in gliders and sport planes. They were ordered to report to the Engels School of Aviation, located safely behind the front lines on the Volga River, to begin a training program that would normally take years but was compressed into a few grueling months. The atmosphere was a mix of patriotic fervour and crushing anxiety, as these young women boarded trains heading east, leaving behind burning villages and occupied cities, carrying with them the weight of their gender's reputation and the survival of their homeland. They arrived at Engels to find that the military was wholly unprepared for them. There were no women's uniforms, no boots that fit their smaller feet, and a distinct lack of welcome from the male instructors who viewed the entire project as a publicity stunt or a desperate joke. They were given ill-fitting men's tunics that hung down to their knees, and boots they had to stuff with rags to keep from falling off, yet their determination remained unbreakable. This marked the beginning of a transformation that would turn students and factory workers into the most feared nocturnal predators of the Eastern Front. But before they could strike terror into the hearts of the Nazis, they had to prove they could survive the training. The training regime at the Engels School of Aviation was not merely a crash course in flying. It was a grueling test of physical and mental endurance designed to weed out anyone who lacked the steel required for the front lines. And Marina Raskova, despite her motherly affection for the recruits, drove them harder than any male commander would have dared. The women were subjected to 14-hour days that combined intense classroom instruction on navigation, ballistics, and meteorology, with endless hours of flight practice, compressing what was standardly a 3-year military aviation curriculum into less than 6 frenetic months. Every moment was accounted for, with sleep becoming a rare luxury, and the freezing Russian winter turning the airfield into a test of survival before combat even began. As the training progressed, Raskova divided her volunteers into 3 distinct regiments based on their aptitude and skill levels: the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, which would fly the fast and agile Yak-1 fighters, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, assigned the heavy and complex Petlyakov P-2 dive bombers, and finally, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the unit that would eventually become the legendary Night Witches. While the pilots of the 586th and 587th received modern, all-metal aircraft that could theoretically compete with German technology, the women of the 588th were led to a corner of the airfield where their combat aircraft awaited them, and the sight was enough to dishearten even the most optimistic volunteer. They were issued the Polikarpov PO2, a biplane design from 1928 that was hopelessly obsolete by the standards of the 1940s and was primarily used as a training aircraft or a crop duster, earning it the unglamorous nickname Kukuruznik, or corn cutter. To the American eye, the Po-2 looked like something from a museum or a barnstorming show, constructed entirely of plywood struts and canvas skin stretched over a wooden frame, powered by a modest 100-horsepower 5-cylinder engine that sounded more like a lawnmower than a warplane. It had an open cockpit that offered zero protection from the elements, meaning the pilots would be exposed to wind, rain, and sub-zero temperatures that could freeze skin in minutes, and it lacked even the most basic instruments required for modern warfare. No radio to communicate with the ground or each other, no radar to spot enemies, and absolutely no armour plating to protect the pilot or the fuel tank. The top speed of the Po-2 was roughly 94 miles per hour, which was slower than most automobiles of the era and significantly slower than the stall speed of the advanced German Messerschmitt fighters they would be facing, meaning the Nazis literally could not fly slow enough to stay behind them without falling out of the sky. The plane was so light and fragile that ground crews had to physically hold onto the wings during takeoff in strong winds to prevent it from flipping over, and a few well-placed incendiary bullets could turn the canvas skin into a blazing inferno in seconds. Furthermore, because weight was such a critical issue for the underpowered engine, the women were initially forbidden from carrying parachutes, a grim calculation that meant if their plane was hit, they had to ride it down to their deaths. Yet, despite the terrifying inadequacy of their equipment, the women of the 588th did not revolt or despair. Instead, they embraced the Po-2 with a fierce protectiveness, learning to exploit its unique handling characteristics and mastering the art of low-altitude flying, where faster planes dared not venture. The mechanics, who were also women, learned to service the engines in conditions so cold that metal stuck to bare skin, often working through the night with bare hands to ensure the planes were ready for the next sortie. They modified the bomb racks to carry primitive explosives, realizing they would have to fly multiple missions per night to drop a meaningful payload, as the plane could only carry 2 bombs at a time. By the time the snow began to melt in the spring of 1942, the training was complete, and the women of the 588th, now a cohesive and disciplined fighting force, stood ready for deployment, their wooden planes gleaming in the sun, unaware that they were about to be sent to the most critical and bloody sector of the entire war, the southern front, where the Germans were pushing towards Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. They had passed their exams with perfect scores, shocking the sceptical male inspectors who had expected them to fail, and now, with their hair cut short and their oversized uniforms finally broken in, they prepared to fly straight into the mouth of hell, armed with nothing but plywood, canvas, and an unbreakable will to defend their homeland. In May 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment finally received their deployment orders, arriving at the front lines in the southern sector of the Soviet-German front, a region that was rapidly crumbling under a renewed German offensive aimed at the oil-rich Caucasus and the strategic city of Stalingrad. When the women landed their flimsy biplanes at the dusty airstrip of Trudgornyaka, the reception from the male soldiers stationed there was far from welcoming. It was a mixture of open ridicule, condescension, and disbelief. The hardened male pilots, flying modern fighters and bombers, looked at the young women in their oversized uniforms and their wooden crop dusters with contempt, dubbing them the kitchen squadron and making crude jokes that they would be better off peeling potatoes than trying to fight the Luftwaffe. General indifference was the best they could hope for, while many commanders viewed their presence as a liability, fearing they would have to waste resources rescuing little girls who got lost or panicked in combat. The regiment was under the command of Major Yevdokia Bashanskaya, a woman of iron will and exceptional piloting skill, who understood that the only way to silence the critics was through perfection. So she imposed a level of discipline that was stricter than any male unit, forbidding makeup, alcohol and fraternization, and demanding that her pilots maintain a stoic professionalism at all times. The reality of their mission quickly set in as they prepared for their first combat sorties. They were to fly only at night because the Po-2 was defenseless against enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns during the day, effectively becoming sitting ducks for any German gunner with decent aim. Their mission profile was simple but terrifying: harass the enemy, destroy supply depots, bomb river crossings, and deny the German troops any sleep, psychological warfare that relied on the cover of darkness. The first few missions were a baptism of fire in the truest sense, as the crews realized the utter darkness of the Russian night was both their best friend and their deadliest enemy. Flying without radio communication meant they couldn't warn each other of danger, and flying without illuminated flight instruments meant the pilots had to navigate by instinct, leaning out of the open cockpit to watch for landmarks like river bends, railroad tracks, or the muzzle flashes of artillery on the ground. The wind roared in their ears, drowning out the engine, while the bitter cold at altitude gnawed at their exposed faces. But the real terror began when they approached the target zone. As they neared German positions, the sky would suddenly erupt with the blinding beams of searchlights, creating a deadly web of light designed to trap the slow-moving biplanes like flies in a spiderweb. Once a plane was caught in the cone of a searchlight, the German anti-aircraft flak cannons, specifically the terrifying 37 mm and 20 mm rapid-fire guns, would open up, filling the sky with exploding shells that could shred the canvas wings of a Po-2 in seconds. The women learned very quickly that their lives depended on agility and deception, realizing that their aircraft's slowness was actually a strange advantage. They could turn tighter than any German fighter and fly so low that they were effectively invisible to radar and difficult to track with heavy guns. Tragedy struck early, as it always does in war, and the loss of the first crew sent a shockwave through the regiment, driving home the reality that their wooden planes were essentially flying coffins if a single incendiary round hit the fuel tank. Yet, instead of breaking their spirit, these losses hardened their resolve, transforming the nervous graduates of Engels into vengeful warriors who stopped caring about the mockery of the men and focused entirely on making the Nazis pay for every inch of Soviet soil. They began flying up to 8, 10, or even 15 missions in a single night, returning to base only long enough to refuel and rearm before taking off again into the darkness, a relentless tempo that began to draw the attention of the German commanders across the lines who couldn't understand how these silent, ghostly planes were causing so much damage. The kitchen squadron was gone. The night witches were beginning to rise, and the Germans were about to learn that the most dangerous sound in the night sky was the whisper of the wind over canvas wings. It was during the intense and bloody struggles over the Caucasus foothills in late 1942 that the women of the 588th perfected the signature attack tactic that would not only define their legacy, but also spawn the terrifying moniker Nachthexen, or night witches. The tactic was born out of necessity, a brilliant improvisation that turned the Po-2's greatest weakness, its lack of speed and power, into a stealth capability that modern aviation engineers spend billions trying to replicate. As they approached their target coordinates, usually a German encampment, supply depot or airfield, the pilot would throttle the engine all the way back to idle or cut it completely, allowing the biplane to glide silently through the darkness like a ghost. Without the roar of the engine, the only sound the aircraft made was a soft, rhythmic, whooshing noise created by the wind whistling through the canvas wings and the tension wires that held the wooden struts together. To the terrified German soldiers on the ground, huddled in their freezing trenches and desperate for sleep, this sound was indistinguishable from the mythical sound of a witch's broomstick sweeping across the sky, a realization that often came mere seconds before the bombs whistled down and exploded in their midst. The psychological impact of this was devastating. The Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht were used to the loud mechanical roar of heavy bombers that gave them ample time to scramble to shelters or man the anti-aircraft guns, but the Po-2 gave no warning. The bombs would detonate, causing chaos and destruction, and by the time the searchlight swept the sky, the silent attacker had often already restarted her engine and banked away into the shadows, leaving the Germans firing wildly into the empty night. This constant harassment denied the German troops their most valuable resource, sleep. The night witches didn't just destroy physical targets. They waged a campaign of psychological terror, keeping entire divisions awake night after night, leading to exhaustion, frayed nerves, and a crushing sense of paranoia among the Nazi ranks. The Germans were so baffled by the skill and audacity of these female pilots that they refused to believe ordinary Soviet women were capable of such feats. Wild rumours began to circulate among the German infantry and airmen that these pilots were not normal humans but a special breed of she-devils recruited from Soviet prisons, or that they had been given experimental injections and pills by Soviet scientists that gave them feline night vision, allowing them to see in the pitch black like cats. These myths served a dual purpose. They rationalized the Germans' inability to shoot down inferior wooden planes, and they added a layer of supernatural dread to the enemy. The German High Command took the threat so seriously that they allegedly issued an automatic Iron Cross, a prestigious military decoration usually reserved for acts of significant bravery, to any German pilot or gunner who managed to shoot down one of these elusive biplanes. However, for the women in the cockpits, there was nothing supernatural about their work. It was a grueling, back-breaking marathon of physical labour and extreme danger. Because the Po-2 had such a pathetic weight capacity, it could only carry 2 bombs at a time, meaning that to have any real effect on the enemy, the pilots had to fly multiple sorties in a single night. It was not uncommon for a single crew to fly 8, 10, or even 18 missions between sunset and sunrise, landing only to have the ground crews, young women who were often stronger than the men, manually lift and strap 100-kilogram bombs under the wings in the freezing cold, refuel the tank, and send them back up within minutes. The physical toll on the pilots and navigators was immense. The open cockpits meant they were constantly blasted by freezing wind, often resulting in frostbite on their faces and hands, and the sheer exhaustion of flying combat missions all night left them hallucinating from fatigue. They carried no parachutes until 1944 to save weight, meaning every mission was a choice to accept death rather than capture, especially since they carried pistols with one bullet saved for themselves in case they crashed behind enemy lines, as the stories of what the Nazis did to captured female partisans were the stuff of nightmares. The bond between the pilot in the front seat and the navigator in the back became telepathic. The navigator, often hanging halfway out of the plane to drop flares or spot targets, was the eyes of the operation, while the pilot was the hands, and together they danced a nightly ballet of death under the nose of a technologically superior enemy who simply could not stop them. As the reputation of the Night Witches grew along the Eastern Front, the German Luftwaffe, pride of the Nazi war machine, found itself in an embarrassing and maddening predicament. Their state-of-the-art Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, machines capable of breaking sound barriers in dives and shredding heavy bombers with cannon fire, were struggling to shoot down plywood biplanes that barely flew faster than a car on a highway. This created a bizarre aerodynamic paradox that the Soviet women learned to exploit with masterful precision. The stall speed of a German fighter, the slowest speed it could fly before losing lift and falling out of the sky, was significantly higher than the top speed of the Po-2. This meant that if a German ace tried to slow down enough to line up a shot on a Night Witch, his advanced fighter would begin to shudder and stall, forcing him to peel away to regain control. But if he came in at normal combat speed, he would zip past the slow-moving biplane in the blink of an eye, giving him only a fraction of a second to aim and fire. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse where the mouse could turn on a dime, and the cat was too fast for its own good, leading to instances where the women would fly aggressively low, hugging the contours of ravines, forests and hillsides, practically scraping the treetops where the high-speed German fighters dared not follow for fear of crashing into the terrain. However, this agility was their only defence, for if a German pilot did manage to land a hit, the results were catastrophic and horrific. The Po-2 was essentially a flying matchstick, its wooden frame and fabric skin coated in highly flammable dope lacquer, meaning that a single incendiary bullet from a German machine gun didn't just punch a hole, it would ignite the entire aircraft instantly. Since the women flew without parachutes during the early years of the war to save weight for an extra bomb or fuel, a fire on board left them with a grim choice: burn to death in the cockpit or jump to their death without a chute. A nightmare scenario that played out all too often in the dark skies over Russia. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks, no armour plating behind the pilot's seat, and no fire extinguishers that could handle an aviation fuel fire, making every trace around that zipped past their heads a potential death sentence. Despite these odds, the navigators in the back seat, often young women who had abandoned university studies for the war, performed miracles of navigation using tools that were practically medieval compared to their enemies. They had no radar, no sophisticated radio navigation systems, and often flew in weather so bad that the main Soviet Air Force remained grounded. Instead, they navigated by stopwatch, compass, and looking over the side of the cockpit to spot landmarks like river bends, church spires, or railroad tracks illuminated by the moon. In the pitch black of a moonless night, the navigator would sometimes have to climb out of her seat and hang precariously over the side of the fuselage, battling the freezing slipstream to look for the faint glint of snow or the flash of a signal flare from Soviet ground troops. The physical environment was as much an enemy as the Nazis. In the bitter Russian winter, temperatures at altitude would plummet to -40 degrees, freezing the wind tears to their faces and causing frostbite that turned fingers and toes black. Yet they could not wear heavy insulated gloves because they needed tactile sensitivity to feel the controls and operate the bomb sites. They would often land with their flight suits frozen stiff, requiring ground crews to physically lift them out of the cockpits and carry them to a warm stove before they could thaw out enough to debrief and prepare for the next sortie. This relentless exposure to the elements combined with the stress of combat and chronic sleep deprivation, meant that the women aged prematurely, their young faces hardened by the brutal reality of a war where they were hunted by the most technologically advanced air force on Earth. Yet night after night, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the engines would cough to life, and the witches would take to the sky again. The German High Command, humiliated by the continuous losses inflicted by the sewing machines, as they derisively called the Po-2s, eventually realised that standard dogfighting tactics were useless against the Night Witches, so they developed a terrifying new countermeasure specifically designed to slaughter the slow-moving biplanes. This deadly innovation was known among the Soviet pilots as the Flak Circus, or the Cone of Death, a coordinated trap involving powerful synthetic searchlights and heavy anti-aircraft artillery arranged in concentric circles around key targets like rail hubs and ammunition dumps. The tactic was brutally simple. The Germans would leave the sky dark and silent, baiting the Soviet pilots into thinking they were undetected. But the moment a PO2 entered the kill zone, dozens of massive searchlights would simultaneously snap on, trapping the tiny wooden plane in a blinding cage of light that was impossible to escape. Once illuminated, the pilot was effectively blind, unable to see her instruments or the ground, while the German flak gunners, having a perfectly lit stationary target, would unleash a torrent of exploding shells that would tear the fabric wings to shreds in seconds. One of the most harrowing nights in the regiment's history occurred in the summer of 1943 over the Cuban bridgehead, where this tactic was deployed with devastating efficiency, resulting in a scene of horror that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. On that fateful night, the Germans brought in a specialised ace night fighter pilot, Josef Koschok, who had painted his Messerschmitt black and idled high above the searchlight ring, waiting for the moths to fly into the flame. As the first pair of Night Witches approached, the lights caught them, and instead of flak, Koschok swooped down, firing incendiary rounds that instantly ignited the fuel tanks of the wooden biplanes. From the airfield below, the rest of the regiment watched in helpless agony as their sisters burned alive in the sky. The slow descent of the Po-2s meaning the crews suffered for agonizing minutes as they spiraled down like falling torches. 4 planes were lost in rapid succession that night, claiming the lives of 8 women, a blow that would have shattered the morale of a lesser unit. But the Night Witches reacted with a cold, vengeful fury. Instead of grounding the flights, Major Bashanskaya ordered the remaining pilots back into the air immediately, knowing that if they stopped now, fear would take root. They flew mission after mission until dawn, dropping bombs on the very searchlights and guns that had killed their friends, proving to the Germans that they could not be broken by terror. It was in this crucible of fire that legends like Nadezhda Popova emerged, a pilot who would eventually fly 852 missions and become one of the most famous of the witches. Popova once described returning from a mission where her plane was so riddled with bullet holes that it looked like lace. She found bullet holes in her map case, her helmet, and even the scarf around her neck. Yet she had not been scratched. A miracle she attributed to sheer luck and the adrenaline of survival. The bond between these women transcended typical military camaraderie. They were sisters in a very literal sense, sharing their food, their clothes, and their deepest fears, often singing songs and embroidering in their dugouts while waiting for the sun to set, only to transform into stone-cold killers the moment they climbed into their cockpits. They developed a unique method of dealing with the searchlights. They would fly in pairs, where one plane would intentionally draw the fire and the lights, acting as live bait to distract the German gunners, while the second plane would glide in silently from the darkness to drop its payload on the exposed searchlights. A tactic that required nerves of steel and absolute trust in one's wingman. This constant proximity to death stripped away all pretense. They ceased to be just women flying planes and became a force of nature, a collective entity that absorbed grief and converted it into fuel for the next night's attack. While the pilots were the visible spearhead of the regiment, the miracle of the Night Witches was sustained by the Herculean efforts of the ground crews, the armourers, and mechanics who were also exclusively women, and whose war was fought not in the sky, but in the freezing mud of makeshift airfields where the battle against exhaustion was just as deadly. These young women, many of whom were barely out of their teens, performed a nightly logistical ballet that defies modern comprehension, turning the slow wooden biplanes into a relentless conveyor belt of destruction that hammered the German lines without pause. Every time a Po-2 touched down, the clock started ticking and the ground crews would sprint to the aircraft, often slipping on ice or wading through knee-deep slush, to manually haul heavy fuel canisters and 100-kilogram bombs to the waiting planes. There were no hydraulic lifts or specialised loading vehicles. Everything was done by human muscle, with two women often struggling to lift a bomb that weighed nearly as much as they did, hoisting it up to the wing racks with groans of exertion that were swallowed by the roar of the engines. In a single night of intense combat, a ground crew might lift upwards of 3 tons of explosives, effectively weightlifting a heavy truck over the course of a shift, all while working in temperatures so cold that touching bare metal could strip the skin off their hands. The turnaround time was trimmed down to a miraculous few minutes, just enough time for the pilot to gulp down a cup of hot tea, receive a quick briefing on the next target, and maybe smoke a cigarette with trembling hands before the prop was spun and she was airborne again. It was during the heavy fighting in the Donbas region and the push towards the Crimea that the physical limits of the human body were tested to their absolute breaking point. With pilots like Nadezhda Popova and her navigator Katya Ryabova setting a staggering record of 18 sorties in a single night. To put that into perspective for an American audience accustomed to modern warfare, where a pilot might fly 1 or 2 sorties a day, Popova effectively took off, flew into combat, dropped bombs, and landed every 30 minutes for an entire night, a feat of endurance that left her so physically shattered by dawn that she had to be lifted out of the cockpit because her legs were too numb to move, and she was practically deaf from the engine noise. Yet, amidst this industrial-scale violence, the women fought fiercely to hold on to their humanity and their femininity, refusing to become the soulless killing machines the war demanded they be. In the brief hours of daylight while the rest of the army worked, the night witches slept, but in their waking moments they embroidered patterns on their foot wraps, used navigation pencils to colour their lips when lipstick ran out, and decorated their cramped dugouts with wild flowers gathered from the edges of the airfield. This wasn't vanity. It was a psychological shield, a way to remind themselves that there was a world beyond the blood and the fire, and that they were still women with dreams of love, families, and peace. They even modified their oversized, clumsy men's uniforms to fit better, tailoring the tunics and stuffing the boots with newspaper for warmth, creating a unique night witch style that bewildered the male officers who visited their base. There is a poignant story of a male general who came to inspect the famous regiment, expecting to find Amazonian warriors of stone, but instead found young girls drying their hair in the sun and knitting socks, a sight that reportedly moved him to tears as he realized that the terrors of the night were being inflicted by children who should have been in school. However, this softness vanished the moment the sun went down. The Germans, desperate to stop them, began dropping propaganda leaflets over their airfield, promising the little ladies safe conduct and warm beds if they defected, claiming that their Bolshevik masters were using them as cannon fodder. The women used these leaflets for the only thing they deemed them good for, rolling tobacco for cigarettes, laughing at the Nazis' clumsy attempts to demoralize a unit that had already stared death in the face 1,000 times. The regiment had become a family, a sorority of steel where the loss of one was felt by all, yet they never allowed grief to ground them. Instead, they painted for the motherland, and the names of their fallen sisters on the sides of their fuselages, turning their grief into a weapon that they delivered to the enemy with terrifying precision night after night. By the summer of 1943, the scepticism and mockery that had once dogged the unit had completely evaporated, replaced by a reverence so profound that the Soviet High Command bestowed upon them its most prestigious collective honour, the designation of Guards. No longer just the 588th, they were renamed the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, a title that was reserved only for units that had displayed extraordinary heroism and combat proficiency, effectively cementing their status as elite warriors of the Red Army. This recognition, which came with slightly better rations and a distinct badge, arrived just as they were thrown into the meat grinder of the Taman Peninsula to break the infamous Blue Line, a massive solidified German defensive network that was essentially the Nazi equivalent of the Maginot Line in the east. The Blue Line was a nightmare of military engineering, a dense concentration of concrete bunkers, minefields, and overlapping zones of anti-aircraft fire designed to stop the Soviet advance into Crimea at all costs, creating a wall of flak so thick that pilots described flying through it as flying through a thunderstorm of metal. It was in the skies over Taman that the relationship between the Night Witches and their male counterparts underwent a complete and touching transformation. The male fighter pilots of neighbouring regiments, who had once cracked jokes about the kitchen squadron, now viewed the women with a protective awe, often risking their own lives to escort the slow-moving Po-2s if they were caught out by the rising sun. This mutual respect blossomed into deep friendships and frantic, tragic wartime romances, where weddings were held in dugouts with tin rings and parachute silk dresses, only for one spouse to be killed a week later, leaving the survivor to carry a grief so heavy it threatened to ground them. Yet, the war waited for no one's heart to heal, and the regiment was soon tasked with one of their most dangerous humanitarian missions, the Kerch-Eltigen operation, where Soviet Marines were trapped on a tiny freezing beachhead in Crimea, completely cut off from supply lines and facing annihilation by German forces. The Night Witches became their only lifeline, shifting from bombing runs to low-altitude supply drops, flying their biplanes so low over the turbulent Black Sea that their wheels almost skimmed the waves to avoid German radar. They dropped sacks of food, ammunition and medical supplies to the starving wounded soldiers below, requiring a precision that was borderline suicidal. If they dropped the cargo from too high, the wind would carry it into Nazi trenches, but if they flew too low, they risked crashing into the cliffs or being shredded by small arms fire from the ground. The soldiers on the beachhead, huddled in freezing foxholes, would weep with relief when they heard the distinctive popping sound of the Po-2 engines in the dark, knowing that their sisters had returned to save them. During these missions, the pilots were so exhausted that they often hallucinated seeing non-existent mountains in the clouds or hearing voices in the wind, yet they refused to stop, flying up to 12 sorties a night to keep the beachhead alive. They even weaponized their sense of humour to break the crushing tension. On some missions, instead of bombs, they would drop empty champagne bottles or metal drums over German lines. As these objects fell through the air, the wind whistling over their open necks created a terrifying, high-pitched, screaming sound that mimicked the noise of a falling heavy bomb, sending the German troops scrambling into their bunkers in panic, only for the bottle to shatter harmlessly, a psychological prank that kept the enemy awake and terrified without wasting a single ounce of explosive. This psychological dominance was total. The Germans grew so paranoid of the silent death that they began doubling their night watches, further degrading their combat effectiveness, while the witches ruled the darkness, proving that a plywood plane flown by a determined woman was more dangerous than a tank driven by a terrified man. By the spring of 1944, the tide of the war had irrevocably turned, and the Red Army was ruthlessly pushing the Wehrmacht back towards the borders of the Third Reich. But for the Night Witches, this period of impending victory was marked by one of the most heartbreaking losses in the regiment's history, a tragedy that underscored the brutal reality that heroes bleed just like everyone else. The battle for the liberation of Crimea was reaching its fever pitch, and the skies over the city of Kerch were a cauldron of exploding flak and blinding searchlights as the Germans, backed into a corner, fought with the ferocity of doomed men. It was here, on a raid against heavily fortified German transport columns, that the regiment lost its beloved head navigator, Guard Senior Lieutenant Yevgenia Rudneva, a woman whose story encapsulates the tragic loss of potential that war inflicts on a generation. Rudneva was not a born soldier. In her civilian life, she was a brilliant astronomer, a gentle soul who had been studying the stars at Moscow State University before the invasion forced her to navigate by them in a war zone. She was the intellectual heart of the unit, a soft-spoken scholar who spent her rare free moments teaching the other pilots about the constellations and dreaming of a future where she could return to her telescope. Yet she had flown over 640 combat missions, dropping death on the enemy with a terrifyingly cool efficiency. On that fateful night in April, while flying with pilot Praskovya Panna Prokofyeva, their Po-2 was caught in the crosshairs of a flak battery. A shell tore through the fuselage, instantly setting the canvas ablaze and turning the plane into a meteor that illuminated the night sky. Witnesses from other planes watched in horror as the burning aircraft slowly arced downward, the flames consuming the cockpit where Rudneva and Prokofyeva sat, before crashing behind enemy lines in a massive explosion that left no survivors. The loss of Zhenya, as they affectionately called her, devastated the regiment. She was their moral compass, the stargazer, who reminded them of the beauty of the universe amidst the ugliness of war. And her death served as a grim reminder that no amount of skill could protect them from a lucky shot. It was largely due to tragedies like this that the Soviet High Command finally relented on a policy that had terrified the women for 3 years. In the summer of 1944, the Night Witches were finally issued parachutes. For years they had flown without them, partly to save weight for extra bombs, and partly due to supply shortages, accepting that a fire on board meant certain death. But now, with victory on the horizon, the leadership decided that these experienced veterans were too valuable to lose so cheaply. The arrival of the parachutes was met with mixed emotions. While it offered a chance of survival, the heavy packs added nearly 25 pounds of dead weight to an already underpowered aircraft, forcing the pilots to reduce their bomb loads or fuel, which many felt compromised their effectiveness. Furthermore, the parachutes were bulky and uncomfortable in the cramped cockpits, restricting their movement and making it harder to lean over the side for navigation. Yet the order was absolute: wear them or don't fly. This new equipment changed the psychological dynamic of their missions. Now, if a plane was hit, the pilot and navigator had a split-second decision to make: bail out into the pitch-black void over enemy territory, risking capture, torture, and execution by the Nazis who despised them, or try to ride the damaged plane back to friendly lines. The fear of capture was so intense that many of the women made a pact that they would never be taken alive, keeping their final bullet ready even while wearing the parachutes, knowing that for a Soviet Night Witch, falling into the hands of the SS would be a fate far worse than dying in a crash. As the front lines moved westward, crossing the Soviet border and entering Poland, the landscape of their war changed dramatically. They were no longer flying over the familiar steppes and villages of their homeland, but over foreign cities and unfamiliar terrain, a shift that brought a strange sense of dislocation. They were now invaders in the eyes of the locals, or liberators depending on who you asked, and the navigation became even more difficult as the maps of Eastern Europe were often outdated or inaccurate. Yet the tempo never slowed. As the Red Army steamrolled towards Germany, the Night Witches were the constant shadow hanging over the retreating Wehrmacht, a reminder that the crimes committed on Soviet soil were being followed by a relentless, avenging angel that would not stop until the hammer and sickle flew over Berlin. As the Night Witches crossed the border into the Third Reich in late 1944 and early 1945, the nature of the war underwent a terrifying transformation, shifting from a desperate crusade of liberation to a grim, grinding campaign of retribution carried out in the heart of the enemy's lair. Flying over East Prussia was unlike anything the women had experienced in the steppes of Russia or the mountains of the Caucasus. They were now entering the most heavily defended airspace in human history, where the Germans were fighting with the fanatical desperation of men defending their own front porches. The Nazi propaganda machine had whipped the local population and the military into a frenzy of fear, and the anti-aircraft defences they encountered were so dense that the pilots described the night sky not as a dark void, but as a sea of fire that glowed perpetually with the red, angry light of tracer rounds and burning cities. The Germans deployed flak trains, armoured locomotives mounting heavy anti-aircraft guns, that would patrol the rail lines the witches were trying to destroy, creating mobile zones of death that could appear anywhere, any time. The searchlight belts in East Prussia were no longer just scattered batteries. They were organised into light walls, solid curtains of illumination that stretched for miles, designed to blind the pilots and expose them to the waiting 37 cannons. To fly into this inferno required a suppression of the survival instinct that borders on madness, yet the women of the 46th Guards Regiment did it night after night, fueled by a cold, hardened rage that had calcified in their souls during the liberation of Poland. As the Red Army advanced, the true scale of Nazi atrocities became undeniably visible. The pilots heard the first-hand reports and saw the physical evidence of the death camps like Majdanek, where the industrial slaughter of millions had taken place. This wasn't just war anymore. It was a confrontation with absolute evil, and the knowledge of what the Germans had done stripped away any remaining fatigue or hesitation. A pilot who might have been trembling with exhaustion an hour before would climb into her cockpit with steady hands, driven by the thought that every bomb she dropped was a small act of cosmic justice for the ashes they had found in the ovens of Poland. This psychological hardening was necessary because the physical danger had reached its peak. The airspace over Germany was becoming lethally crowded, as the entire might of the Soviet Air Force was compressed into a shrinking geographical box. The slow-moving Po-2s were now sharing the sky with thousands of fast-moving Soviet fighters, heavy bombers, and attack aircraft, creating a chaotic traffic jam of death, where the risk of mid-air collision was just as high as being shot down. There were terrifying incidents where a squadron of massive Soviet bombers would roar out of the clouds, their wake turbulence hitting the fragile biplanes like a physical hammer, flipping them upside down or sending them into uncontrollable spins mere hundreds of feet above the ground. The pilots had to develop a sixth sense for the presence of other aircraft, constantly swiveling their heads to check for the dark shapes of friendly bombers that could crush them without even realizing it. To avoid this congestion and the murderous high-altitude flak, the Night Witches began flying aggressively low, sometimes at shaving flight levels, where they were practically skimming the slate roofs of German Gothic towns and the tops of pine forests. This low-altitude flying brought them face-to-face with the enemy in a bizarrely intimate way. Pilots reported seeing the terrified faces of German soldiers diving into ditches as the sewing machine engine noise suddenly cut out above them, and they could smell the smoke of German cooking fires mixed with the cordite of battle. The witches were now hunting in the enemy's backyard, bringing the terror of the Eastern Front directly to the people who had started it, and as they inched closer to Berlin, they knew that the beast was wounded but still lethal, thrashing with a violence that would claim many more of their sisters before the final victory flag could be raised. As the Soviet war machines smashed into the final defensive lines, protecting Berlin in the early months of 1945, the Night Witches found themselves flying in an apocalyptic landscape where the distinction between night and day had virtually vanished under the constant hellish glow of burning cities and artillery barrages. The battle for the Oder was not just a military operation, it was the final crushing blow against the Third Reich, and for the women of the 46th Guards, it represented the terrifying climax of their journey, where the risk of death was statistically higher than ever before. This wasn't just about dropping bombs anymore, it was a race against time and fate, as every pilot harboured the silent, agonizing fear of becoming the last casualty of a war that was practically won, a psychological torture that kept them awake long after their engines had cooled. The spring of 1945 saw the regiment moving bases with frantic speed, sometimes relocating every few days to keep pace with the rapidly advancing tank columns, often setting up camp on captured German airfields, or even utilising wide stretches of the concrete autobahn as improvised runways. The contrast between their previous miserable dugouts in the Russian mud and these new quarters was jarring. The women found themselves sleeping in abandoned German barracks with electricity, mirrors and soft beds, surrounded by the alien Gothic architecture of a nation they had learned to hate. Yet they were often too wired with adrenaline to rest. The intensity of the combat over the Oder River was unlike anything in the annals of aviation history, with the airspace becoming so congested that the Night Witches were forced to fly in tight, disciplined formations to avoid being rammed by their own side's heavy bombers or shot down by the nervous, trigger-happy anti-aircraft gunners on the ground who shot at anything that moved in the dark. The Germans, realizing the end was near, threw everything they had left into the sky, creating a flak hell so dense that pilots reported the air smelled of sulphur and burning iron even at altitude, and the searchlights were now numbered in the thousands, creating a blinding artificial daylight that stripped away the Witch's primary advantage of stealth. It was during these final chaotic weeks that the utter absurdity of the technological mismatch became most apparent. Here were young women flying fabric-covered biplanes designed in the 1920s, sharing the sky with the first operational jet fighters in history, the Messerschmitt Me-262s, which were zooming past at 500 miles per hour. While the jets were too fast to effectively engage the Slopo 2s, their presence signalled that the Witches were fighting in a twilight zone, where the past and the future of warfare were colliding. The strain on the navigators was excruciating, as the landscape below was a shapeless ruin of smoking craters, twisted metal, and flooding from destroyed dams, making map reading nearly impossible and forcing them to rely on the fires of burning towns to guide their way to the target. Despite the imminent victory, the losses continued to mount with cruel regularity, and the grief was sharper now because the end was so close. Every empty bunk in the barracks was a tragic reminder of a life cut short mere weeks before the finish line, leaving a hole in the regiment that victory parades could never fill. The emotional burden was immense, yet they flew with a savage determination, dropping their payloads on the last pockets of resistance, driven by the collective memory of every friend they had buried from the Caucasus to the Polish border. They were no longer just soldiers, they were the grim reapers of the Soviet advance, clearing the path for the tanks to roll into the heart of Berlin, and they knew that until the final gun fell silent, their job was not done. No matter how much their bodies screamed for rest or how much their souls ached for peace. When the final curtain fell on the European theatre in May 1945, it didn't happen with a whisper, but with a roar of jubilation that shook the very foundations of the earth. Yet for the Night Witches, the end of the war was a surreal, almost hallucinatory experience that took days to fully process. The regiment had finished its combat path just north of Berlin, having supported the massive Soviet offensive that finally broke the back of the Wehrmacht, and the last few nights of the war were a blur of frenetic activity where the targets were no longer strategic fortifications, but the desperate fleeing remnants of a broken army. On the night of May 8th, the order came down that the war was effectively over, Nazi Germany had capitulated, and the guns that had been firing non-stop for 4 years finally fell silent. The reaction at the airfield was an explosion of raw, uncontained emotion. The women, who had spent years suppressing their feelings to survive the nightly horrors, finally let go. They ran out of the barracks screaming, weeping, and emptying their pistols into the air in a deafening salute to victory, embracing each other with a desperation born of the realization that they had actually survived the apocalypse. The mechanics, the armourers, the pilots, and the navigators, survivors of a unit that had flown over 23,000 combat sorties and dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs, danced on the tarmac until dawn, drinking whatever alcohol could be found and singing the songs that had sustained them through the darkest winters. But the most symbolic moment came shortly after the surrender, when a group of the Night Witches travelled into the ruins of Berlin to see the heart of the beast they had helped to slay. They walked through the shattered streets of the German capital, past the skeletons of buildings and the mountains of rubble, until they reached the Reichstag, the seat of German power which was now a smoking, pock-marked shell, Thousands of Soviet soldiers had already covered the walls of the building with graffiti, names, dates, and curses against the fascists, and the women of the 46th Guards Regiment added their own mark to history. With pieces of charcoal or chalk, they wrote their names and the name of their regiment on the blackened pillars of the Reichstag, signing off on the war with a defiance that echoed through the ages. The Night Witches were here. It was a moment of profound catharsis, seeing their names, Simshkova, Popova, Ryabova, scrawled on the very building where the plans for their extermination had been drafted. Yet, amidst the celebration, there was a haunting quiet that settled over them. For years, their entire existence had been defined by the adrenaline of the mission, the roar of the engine and the fear of the searchlights. Now, suddenly, the sky was just a sky, not a battlefield, and the silence of the night was no longer a threat but a strange, empty void they didn't know how to fill. They looked at their flimsy Po-2 biplanes, now sitting idle on the grass, and realized that these wooden machines had carried them through hell and back, defying every law of probability and physics. The war was over, but for the women who had lived as creatures of the night, the transition back to the light of peace would prove to be a journey almost as difficult as the war itself. They were heroes, decorated with the highest honours the Soviet Union could bestow, including 23 Hero of the Soviet Union Gold Stars. But they were also young women who had missed out on their youth, their innocence burned away in the fires of the Eastern Front, leaving them with memories that would both sustain and haunt them for the rest of their lives. However, as the dust settled on the ruined cities of Europe and the euphoria of victory began to fade into the stark reality of reconstruction, the Night Witches faced a bitter and unexpected betrayal that would sting almost as much as the freezing winds of the Eastern Front, revealing that while they had won the war, they had not yet won the battle for respect in a male-dominated world. The event that crystallized this disappointment was the preparations for the legendary Moscow Victory Parade of June 24th, 1945, a colossal spectacle intended to showcase the might of the Red Army to the world, featuring thousands of troops, tanks and aircraft streaming through Red Square under the gaze of Stalin. The women of the 46th Guards Regiment, as decorated heroes of the Soviet Union who had flown more sorties than almost any other aviation unit, fully expected to take their rightful place in this historic procession, believing their sacrifices had earned them a spot in the limelight. But when the orders for the parade were issued, the Night Witches were stunned to find they had been excluded, cut from the roster of history in a decision that felt like a slap in the face. The official reasons given by the military command were flimsy and bureaucratic, bordering on insulting. They were told that their beloved Po-2 biplanes, the very machines that had terrorized the Nazis, were too slow to fly in formation with the modern, high-speed fighters and bombers that would be showcased, and that their presence would disrupt the aerial timing. Furthermore, the parade organisers claimed that the women's marching drill was not up to the elite standards required for Red Square, citing that they had spent the war flying and bombing, not practising the goose step, and therefore they would look unimpressive alongside the tall, broad-shouldered male guardsmen. It was a crushing realization that despite their medals and their scars, they were still viewed through a prism of gender bias. They were good enough to die for the motherland in the dark, but they weren't polished enough to represent it in the light. This snub was followed quickly by an even more definitive end to their military careers. In October 1945, barely 6 months after the fall of Berlin, the regiment was officially disbanded. The speed of the demobilization was jarring, as if the Soviet Union was in a hurry to erase the anomaly of female combatants and return to the status quo. The scene at the airfield on the day of disbandment was one of profound sorrow, as the women were ordered to strip their planes of weapons and insignia, effectively dismantling the very extensions of their bodies that had kept them alive. They watched with tear-filled eyes as their faithful Po-2s, the wooden birds that had carried them through flak and fire, were either transferred to training units or, in some heartbreaking cases, scrapped and burned as surplus material. The regiment's battle flag was furled and sent to a museum, and the women were issued their demobilization papers, a final paycheck, and a train ticket home, along with a piece of advice from their commanders that felt alien to their warrior souls. Go home, get married, have children, and forget the war. They were being asked to switch off the soldier inside them like a light switch, to trade their flight suits for floral dresses and their navigation charts for grocery lists, a psychological transition that was violent in its abruptness. There were no counselling services, no support groups for PTSD, and no understanding of how a woman who had dropped bombs on trains was supposed to settle quietly into a life of domesticity. They boarded the trains heading back to Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev, leaving behind the only family that truly understood them, scattering across the vastness of the Soviet Union to face a new, silent battle. The struggle to reintegrate into a society that wanted to celebrate the victory, but was often uncomfortable with the women who had helped secure it. Returning to civilian life in the post-war Soviet Union proved to be a jarring and often humiliating experience for the Night Witches, as they stepped out of the cockpit and into a society that was physically devastated and socially conservative, where the very fact of their military service was often viewed with suspicion rather than gratitude. The country they returned to was a landscape of ruins, with 27 million dead and entire cities reduced to rubble, meaning that the immediate priority was survival, finding food, shelter, and warmth, rather than celebrating the unique achievements of a female aviation regiment. But the cruelest blow came from the societal stigma attached to women who had served at the front. Instead of being hailed as liberators, many were unfairly branded with the derogatory slang term PPZH, or field marching wives, a nasty implication that women in the army had merely served as mistresses for the male officers, rather than as combatants. This profound injustice forced many of the Night Witches to hide their past completely, burying their medals in the bottoms of dresser drawers and never speaking of the war to their new colleagues, neighbours, or even their future husbands, for fear of being judged as loose or damaged. Imagine for a moment a young woman who had flown 800 combat missions, dodged searchlights over Berlin, and watched her best friends burn to death, now standing in a bread line or sitting in a university lecture hall, silently enduring the condescension of men who had never seen a day of combat, while she held inside her the secret knowledge that she was one of the deadliest pilots in history. They were forced to take mundane jobs to survive, transitioning from navigating bombers to teaching mathematics, working in textile factories, or harvesting crops, a shift in reality so extreme that it felt like a hallucination. There were heartbreaking instances where former pilots applied for jobs in civil aviation, hoping to fly for Aeroflot, only to be laughed out of the offices and told that the war is over, a woman's place is in the home, effectively grounding them forever despite their thousands of hours of flight time in the worst conditions imaginable. This forced anonymity created a strange psychological split. By day, they were ordinary Soviet citizens, mothers and workers, indistinguishable from the crowd, but by night, in their dreams, they were still flying the Po-2, hearing the wind in the wires and seeing the tracers arc through the sky. The bond they shared with their regiment sisters became their only lifeline in this new grey world, and they maintained a fierce, underground network of communication, writing letters, and visiting each other whenever they could afford the train tickets, effectively forming a secret society of veterans who were the only ones who could validate each other's memories. It wasn't until years later, often decades, that the silence began to break, sometimes in the most mundane of circumstances. A student might discover that her quiet, grey-haired physics teacher was actually a decorated hero of the Soviet Union who had bombed Nazis, or a factory worker might accidentally drop her purse, spilling out the Gold Star medal she carried for luck, shocking her co-workers into silence. This period of post-war obscurity is perhaps the most tragic chapter of their story because it highlights the universal struggle of female warriors throughout history, the fight to be remembered not just as women who helped, but as soldiers who led. They had defeated the Luftwaffe, but for a long time it seemed they had lost the battle against the crushing weight of traditional gender roles. Yet just like they had waited in the dark for the perfect moment to strike a German train, they waited in the shadows of Soviet society for the right time to reclaim their legacy. It wasn't until the political thaw of the mid-1950s and 60s during the Khrushchev era that the ice surrounding the legacy of the Night Witches began to crack, allowing their incredible stories to finally seep back into the public consciousness of the Soviet Union and eventually the world. The catalyst for this revival was often the women themselves, who, now approaching middle age, realised that if they didn't document their history, it would die with them, lost in the vast amnesiac ocean of Soviet bureaucracy. Major Yevdokia Bashanskaya, their former commander who had been the steel spine of the regiment, became a tireless advocate for her girls, organising reunions that started as small gatherings in Moscow apartments and grew into large emotional events where hundreds of greying women would embrace, weep, and sing the old songs. These reunions were more than just social calls. They were acts of historical preservation, where they would share diaries, photos, and flight logs, piecing together the narrative of the 46th Guards Regiment brick by brick. A significant turning point came with the publication of memoirs and books, most notably by pilots like Marina Chechneva and Raisa Aronova, who put pen to paper to describe the freezing cockpits, the terror of the searchlights, and the camaraderie that had sustained them. These books became bestsellers in the USSR, shocking a younger generation who had grown up thinking of their grandmothers only as babushkas who baked pies, never suspecting that these same hands had once dropped bombs on the Reichstag. The Soviet government, sensing a powerful propaganda tool during the Cold War, finally began to embrace the legend, realising that the story of young communist women defeating the fascist invaders was a perfect narrative for the state. Documentaries were filmed, monuments were erected, and the Night Witches were suddenly in demand for interviews and school visits, where they would stand before wide-eyed children, their chests heavy with medals that chimed softly as they moved, and tell stories that sounded like fantasy. But for the Western world, particularly the United States, the story remained largely unknown, buried behind the Iron Curtain and the fog of the Cold War, where the contributions of Soviet soldiers were often downplayed or ignored entirely. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the archives were fully opened, and Western historians began to uncover the sheer scale of what these women had accomplished, leading to a surge of interest in the West that continues to this day. American aviation enthusiasts and feminists alike were stunned to learn that while the US had the WASPs, women Air Force service pilots, who ferried planes but were barred from combat, the Soviets had unleashed entire regiments of women into the fiercest fighting of the war. This late recognition brought a bittersweet validation to the surviving witches, many of whom were now in their 70s and 80s. They were finally receiving the global accolades they deserved, receiving letters from fans in America, Britain and France, and seeing their faces on the covers of history magazines. One of the most touching moments of this late-life recognition occurred when Nadezhda Popova, one of the most famous aces of the unit, was interviewed for a major Western documentary. Looking into the camera with eyes that had seen everything, she simply said, "We were young and we loved our country, that is all." It was a humble summary of a superhuman effort, a reminder that behind the witch moniker were simply patriotic girls who refused to let their gender dictate their destiny, forcing the world to rewrite its understanding of what women were capable of in the crucible of total war. To truly grasp the magnitude of what the Night Witches achieved, we have to look at the cold, hard mathematics of their war, numbers that seem almost impossible when compared to the standards of American or British aviation during the same period. For an American B-17 bomber crew flying over Europe, a standard tour of duty was typically 25 missions, and surviving that openly was considered a statistical miracle, earning the crew a ticket home and a hero's welcome. In stark contrast, the women of the 46th Guards Regiment viewed 25 missions not as a career capstone, but as a busy weekend. Many of the pilots and navigators flew over 800 combat sorties by the end of the war, and a few, like the legendary Irina Sabrova, broke the 4-digit barrier logging an astounding 1,008 missions. To put that into perspective, Sabrova climbed into her open cockpit, took off into the dark, dodged anti-aircraft fire, and landed safely more than 1,000 times, a feat of endurance and luck that is virtually frantic in the history of aerial warfare. This relentless operational tempo was made possible only by the unique characteristics of the Po-2 and the iron discipline of the crews, who had turned the turnaround process into a NASCAR-style pit stop long before such a thing existed. The moment a plane touched down, the pilot would keep the engine running at a low idle to prevent it from freezing, while the armourers, young women with muscles hardened by labour, would rush out to manually reload the bomb racks and refuel the tank, often completing the entire process in under 7 minutes. This meant that a pilot could theoretically drop her bombs, return to base, reload, and be back over the target before the German searchlight operators had even decided to turn off their lights, creating the illusion that the Soviets had thousands of aircraft, when in reality it was just one regiment flying on a loop. However, this superhuman effort exacted a terrifying physical toll on the women that went far beyond simple fatigue. The constant vibration of the engine, the lack of oxygen at altitude, and the chronic sleep deprivation caused a condition the doctors called combat exhaustion, where the women would stop menstruating, lose their appetites completely, and turn a ghostly translucent white colour that they jokingly referred to as night tan. They were literally wasting away inside their flight suits, fueled only by adrenaline and the sugary tea laced with vodka that the ground crews forced them to drink. Yet, despite their frailty, they possessed a mental fortitude that terrified their male counterparts. There are recorded instances of male pilots from other regiments refusing to fly in weather conditions that the Night Witches accepted as routine. One famous anecdote involves a thick fog rolling over the airfield, grounding the entire male fighter division stationed nearby, while the women of the 46th continued to take off and land by having their ground crews form a human chain along the runway, holding flashlights and singing songs so the pilots could find the strip by sound and faint glimmers of light. This willingness to fly in 0-0 visibility gave them another tactical edge. They could attack when the Germans least expected it, dropping bombs from out of the clouds on nights when the Luftwaffe assumed the sky was safe, reinforcing the Nazi belief that they were facing supernatural beings. The regiment was also unique in its no-waste philosophy. Unlike the male units that were constantly resupplied with fresh recruits and equipment, the Night Witches treated every bomb, every gallon of fuel, and every spare part as gold, knowing that as a secondary unit they were at the bottom of the supply chain. This scarcity bred a culture of extreme innovation, where mechanics would patch bullet holes with pieces of their own uniforms, or use household irons to smooth out the fabric skin of the wings, proving that their war was won as much by the ingenuity of the screwdriver as by the accuracy of the bomb sight. One of the most defining, yet often overlooked aspects of the 46th Guards Regiment's legacy is that they remained the only one of the 3 original female regiments formed by Marina Raskova to stay exclusively female throughout the entire duration of the war, a distinction that forged a unique psychological armour around the unit. While the 586th Fighter Regiment and the 587th Dive Bomber Regiment eventually integrated male pilots and mechanics into their ranks due to heavy casualties and the extreme physical demands of handling the heavier Yak fighters and P-2 bombers, the Night Witches stubbornly refused to dilute their ranks. From the regimental commander down to the lowest mechanic changing oil in the freezing mud, every single pair of hands that touched the PO2s belonged to a woman, creating a self-contained Amazonian republic in the middle of a male-dominated war zone. This total isolation from the male military hierarchy allowed them to develop their own unique culture of warfare, one that prioritized collaboration over competition and maternal protectiveness over bravado, which paradoxically made them more lethal. This unique dynamic was best exemplified in their daring taxi or rescue missions, a role that the Po-2 was accidentally perfect for, and one that endeared them forever to the Soviet fighter aces who patrolled the daylight skies. Because the Po-2 had such a ridiculously low stall speed and could take off and land in spaces no larger than a tennis court, the Night Witches effectively became the world's first combat search and rescue unit for downed pilots behind enemy lines. When a high-value Soviet fighter pilot, flying a fast, heavy plane like a Yak or a Lavochkin, was shot down over German territory, he was often stranded in forests or swamps where a standard rescue plane couldn't possibly land. In these dire situations, the call would go out to the Witches. A single PO-2 would launch into the darkness, navigating through the enemy air defence belt to find the downed airman, often guided only by a signal flare or a flashlight beam. The pilot would land the biplane on rough, uneven terrain, a ploughed field, a frozen river, or a forest clearing, while the Germans, hearing the engine, would send patrols to investigate. The stranded airman, often wounded and freezing, would be stuffed into the navigator's cockpit, sometimes sitting on the navigator's lap if she hadn't stayed behind, and the pilot would gun the engine, bouncing over the rough ground to lift off mere seconds before German trucks or tanks arrived. These rescue missions required a level of cold-blooded precision that is hard to overstate. Landing a fragile wooden plane in the dark on unknown terrain is a recipe for disaster, yet they did it repeatedly, earning them the nickname Angels of Mercy from the very men who had once dismissed them. There is a legendary story of a night witch who landed to rescue a pilot, only to find that the mud was too deep for the plane to take off with the extra weight. Instead of abandoning him, she jumped out, physically lifted the tail of the plane to help it gain momentum while the engine roared, and managed to scramble back into the moving cockpit as it lifted off, a feat of physical strength and desperation that defies belief. This duality, being witches to the Nazis and angels to their own troops, created a complex identity that fascinated the American journalists who eventually learned of them. To the enemy, they were a nightmare made of canvas. To their comrades, they were the big sisters who would fly through hell to bring you home. It also solidified the leadership style of their commander, Yevdokia Bashanskaya, who was the glue holding the regiment together. Unlike male commanders who often ruled through fear and rigid hierarchy, Bashanskaya knew the name of every woman in her unit, knew which ones had received death letters from home about their families, and knew exactly how far she could push them before they broke. She didn't just command a regiment, she managed a family of 400 traumatized young women, turning their collective grief into a weapon of war that was sharper than any bayonet, proving that the feminine approach to leadership was not a weakness in combat, but a force multiplier that the rigid, masculine structure of the German military simply couldn't comprehend or counter. To fully understand the depth of the courage displayed by the Night Witches, one must look beyond the collective identity of the Soviet woman and recognize that the regiment was a tapestry of the Soviet Union's vast ethnic diversity, a fact that added specific, terrifying layers of danger for certain pilots. A prime example is the story of Polina Gelman, a flight navigator who would eventually be named a hero of the Soviet Union. Gelman was not only a woman and a communist, but she was also Jewish, a trifecta of identity that meant if she were ever shot down and captured alive, her fate would not be a prisoner of war camp, but immediate brutal execution or deportation to a death camp like Auschwitz. For Gelman and the other Jewish women in the regiment, the war against the Nazis was deeply personal, an existential struggle against an ideology that sought to wipe their entire bloodline from the face of the earth. This knowledge added a razor-sharp edge to every mission. While other pilots might carry a suicide bullet to avoid torture or interrogation, for the Jewish pilots, that bullet was an absolute necessity, a final act of defiance against a genocide. Gelman flew 857 combat missions, a staggering number that represents years of nightly brushes with death. Yet she survived to become one of the most vocal guardians of the unit's history. Her story highlights a critical psychological aspect of the Night Witches. They were often fighting multiple wars simultaneously, the physical war against the Wehrmacht, the social war against gender bias in their own ranks, and for some, the racial war against Nazi ideology. This intensity of purpose forged a bond that lasted long after the guns fell silent, manifesting in a unique sorority of silence that defined their later years. As these women aged, many suffered from chronic debilitation physical ailments that were directly traceable to their time in the cockpit, yet were rarely acknowledged by the state medical system as war wounds. The spinal compressions from hundreds of hard landings on frozen furrowed fields left many with lifelong back pain. The constant exposure to sub-zero winds in open cockpits caused early onset arthritis and chronic respiratory issues, and the stress of navigating by moonlight ruined the eyesight of many navigators before they turned 40. Yet, they rarely complained, viewing these aches and pains not as afflictions, but as physical receipts of their service, a secret language of the body that only another night witch could understand. When they gathered for their reunions in the 1970s and 80s, often held in parks or modest apartments, they would joke about their creaky wings, using dark humour to cope with the physical legacy of their heroism. Furthermore, the psychological impact of the Po2 rhythm haunted them in ways that modern psychology would recognise as severe PTSD. Many veterans reported that for decades after the war, they could not sleep in total silence. The absence of the engine's roar or the explosion of flak was too unsettling, so they would have to sleep with a radio playing or a window open to hear the city traffic, simulating the noise of the airfield. They had been conditioned to be nocturnal predators, and the transition to being daytime humans was a biological rewiring that never fully took hold for some. This internalized trauma was compounded by the fact that they had to watch the world change around them, seeing the rise of the jet age and the space race, where the crude wooden biplanes they had flown were relegated to the status of antique toys. It was a strange dissonance to watch Yuri Gagarin launch into space in 1961 and realize that less than 20 years prior, they had been fighting the greatest army in Europe using technology that was practically medieval. Yet, interestingly, modern military strategists have begun to look back at the Night Witches not just as a historical curiosity, but as pioneers of what we now call asymmetric warfare, or loitering munition tactics. The core concept of their operation, using cheap, slow, hard-to-detect aircraft to harass a superior high-tech enemy psychologically and physically, is strikingly similar to the modern use of combat drones. In a way, the Night Witches were the grandmothers of the drone age, proving that in war, technological superiority can often be negated by psychological terror, adaptability, and the sheer willingness to do the impossible night after night. Their legacy teaches a timeless lesson. It is not the machine that makes the ace, but the spirit of the pilot inside it, a spirit that in the case of the 46th Guards was made of steel, wrapped in a flight suit, and fueled by a love for a homeland that didn't always love them back. In the final decades of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, a surreal epilogue played out for the surviving Night Witches, one that saw former mortal enemies coming face to face, not across a gun sight, but across a dinner table, offering a profound closure to the trauma of the war. There are recorded instances where German Luftwaffe veterans, now old men living in a unified Germany, reached out to the women they had once hunted, driven by a nagging curiosity to meet the phantoms that had kept them awake for 4 years. One particularly moving anecdote involves a former German Me-109 pilot who, upon meeting one of the Night Witches at a veterans reunion in the 1990s, was brought to tears when he realized the terrifying monster he had been trying to kill was a grandmother standing less than 5 feet tall, offering him tea. He reportedly confessed that had he known they were young women, he wasn't sure if he could have pulled the trigger, a sentiment that reveals the complex morality of war, though the witches, hardened by the atrocities they witnessed, often replied with brutal honesty that they would have shot him down without a second thought because he was an invader on their land. This stark realism is what makes their legacy so compelling to the modern American audience. They fit no stereotype, refusing to be cast as damsels in distress or heartless villains, but simply as patriots who did what was necessary to survive an apocalypse. This grit has rightfully earned them a permanent place in modern pop culture, transcending dry history books to become legends in the digital age. The Swedish heavy metal band Sabaton, widely popular among American gamers and history buffs, released a track titled Night Witches that has racked up millions of views, introducing a new generation of youth to the story of the 588th Regiment, with lyrics that scream "Canvas wings of death, prepare to meet your fate." It is a bizarre but fitting tribute. The quiet, whooshing sound of the wooden Po-2 has been replaced by thundering electric guitars, ensuring that their story is heard loud and clear by a world that almost forgot them. Furthermore, in the world of aviation restoration, the Polikarpov Po-2 has gone from being considered firewood to being one of the most prized warbirds in existence. Wealthy collectors in the US and Europe now spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to restore these crop dusters to flying condition, and when they appear at major air shows like Oshkosh in Wisconsin, the announcers hush the crowds to tell the story of the women who flew them. It is a powerful visual irony to see a restored Po-2 parked next to a P-51 Mustang or a Spitfire. The Western fighters look like Ferraris, sleek, aluminum, powerful, while the Po-2 looks like a lawn chair strapped to a kite. Yet the history books tell us that the kite helped win the war just as much as the Ferrari. This modern reverence also highlights a crucial point about the technology trap in warfare that resonates with military historians today. The Night Witches prove that superior technology does not guarantee victory if the enemy possesses superior will. The Nazis had jet engines, radar, and heavy armour, but they were defeated by plywood, canvas, and the sheer, unquantifiable courage of teenage girls who refused to be conquered. As we look back at their photos today, black and white images of smiling young women in oversized helmets, often holding bouquets of wildflowers just before climbing into a cockpit to face death, we are struck by the duality of their existence. They were the Nachthexen who brought fire and death, but they were also the daughters of a nation fighting for its survival, proving that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal is the human spirit when it has its back against the wall. As we stand here today, deep into the 21st century, the roster of the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment has dwindled to silence. The living voices that once called out coordinates in the dark or sang folk songs in freezing dugouts have now joined the history they helped write, leaving us with a legacy that is as fragile and yet as enduring as the wooden planes they flew. The passing of the last surviving Night Witches, including legends like Nadezhda Popova, who died in 2013, marked the end of a living link to a unique moment in human history, a singular point in time where desperation and courage converged to shatter the glass ceiling of warfare in the most violent way imaginable. For the American audience, accustomed to the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, flexing her muscle as a symbol of female contribution to the war effort, the Night Witches offer a radically different, harder-edged counterpart. While Rosie built the planes, the witches flew them into the jaws of death, proving that the front line has no gender when the survival of a nation is at stake. Their story forces us to re-examine our own history and question why it took Western nations so much longer to allow women into combat roles, effectively making the Soviet experiment of 1941 a visionary, albeit desperate, precursor to the integrated militaries of the modern world. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Night Witches is not about gender, but about the triumph of the human spirit over material inferiority. In an age where we are obsessed with having the latest technology, the fastest jets, and the smartest drones, the image of a young woman in a hand-me-down uniform, flying a crop duster made of plywood and canvas against the might of the Nazi war machine, serves as a humbling reminder that tools are only as effective as the hands that hold them. They proved that you can take the most obsolete, laughable equipment in the world and turn it into a weapon of mass terror if you have enough courage, enough skill, and enough reason to fight. The kukuruznik, the humble corn cutter that was meant to spray pesticides, became a chariot of vengeance that outlasted the 1,000-year Reich. And today, in museums where these planes are displayed, visitors often walk past the sleek jet fighters to marvel at the crude biplane staring at the open cockpit and wondering, how did they do it? The answer is simple and terrifying. They did it because they had no choice, and they did it together. The Night Witches have flown their final sortie, disappearing into the clouds of time, but the sound of their canvas wings still echoes for anyone willing to listen, a whisper in the dark that says nothing is impossible. They were the Night Witches to their enemies, the angels of mercy to their friends, and to history they remain the undisputed queens of the night sky, forever flying in the space between the stars where the flak can no longer reach them. Thank you for watching this incredible journey into the past, and as we close the book on the 46th Guards Regiment, let us remember that heroes don't always wear capes or fly supersonic jets. Sometimes they wear oversized boots and fly wooden kites, and they change the world just the same.